Please welcome Fred Gaffney, founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Security Policy.
Hello, Summiteers. Are any of you people who have been here before? So a few repeat offenders, I guess it's fair to say. All right, well, that helps me a lot because what I'm going to try to do is whip through a lot of stuff, some of which is going to be familiar at least to you, but hopefully reasonably clear to everybody else, on three issues. Two are kind of in the nature of an update on stuff we've been talking about for a long time, necessarily, and one is a new initiative, an action item. So let's get cracking. I always start with a genuflection in the direction of my old boss, and this quote, which I hope you have all committed to memory. Every generation faces an existential threat to freedom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about three of ours. Enemies, foreign and domestic. I could spend the rest of the day talking about the rather large and seemingly growing number of adversaries, foreign and domestic, but I'm going to focus on one. It will not surprise you. I want to talk about this, something that I think is best described, as my friend Andy McCarthy has called it, as Sharia supremacism. And by now, at least you folks who've been here before know that Sharia is at the core of Islam, but it is a very special part of what is described as a religion. Indeed, only about 10% by some estimates has anything to do with religion or pietistic practice as we would think of it in other faiths. The rest of it is pretty much a totalitarian political, military, and legal doctrine, which is kind of the problem. A lot of Muslims, particularly in this country, aren't actually Sharia adherent. Zuhdi Jasser is one who's been here with us before. You've probably seen him many times. A good man, and he says it's man-made law, which is what is known in the Sharia deal as apostasy, which can get him killed. These are the guys who would do the killing because they take this very seriously. They believe that it is their God-directed order to impose this program, not only on all Muslims, but on everybody else. And they will use violence where they can, but they will also use other techniques, as we'll talk about in a moment. This is the most important thing I'm going to tell you today, I think, and that is if we get this right, if we understand what Sharia is, how it operates, we actually can do something about it because it's sedition. It is hostile to, it is meant to displace our Constitution, our freedoms, our civilization. If we get it wrong, which there are a lot of people encouraging us to do, and think it's all a religion and therefore it must be protected by our Constitution, we are doomed, okay? So let's look for just a moment at what's happening in Europe where this Sharia supremacism is washing ashore in places like these boats, all over the continent. It has become a nightmare. It is compounding a problem that has already existed there for some time, which is the demographic of large numbers of Muslims who previously came there. And again, not all of them are a problem, but the Sharia adherent ones for sure are. And it turns out that an awful lot of those who came before in Europe and are coming now are with the Sharia program. The other piece of this that I want to mention, in addition to just refugee jihad, if you will, and in addition to this problem of birth rates, is something called civilization jihad. A kind of pre-violent, stealthy way to accomplish what is ordained by Allah in terms of dominance of the non-Muslim world through basically covert penetration, infiltration, and subversion. This is happening, unfortunately, in the United States of America as well. We have at the bookstore some copies of this. If you can't get it today, which I very much hope you will, I hope you'll download it for free at Secure Freedom Radio. What is it? It is the secret plan of the Muslim Brotherhood for destroying Western civilization from within by our hands and the hands of the believers. That's a direct quote, ladies and gentlemen, from something that was written in 1991 as a report back to the mothership in Egypt, and they've been at it for about 25 years before that report was written, and 25, 26, 7 since, which is kind of a problem. Here's the kicker. The leading edge of the civilization jihad in America and worldwide is to try to silence people like me, and for that matter, anybody else who dares to raise an alarm about this. Who's helping these guys? I suspect this has come to your attention, hasn't it? The left. The Southern Poverty Law Center, a fraud, ladies and gentlemen, a political warfare instrument like what's become of the Anti-Defamation League, now using or being used by all of these Facebook platforms and conniving with the European Union as well. This is an existential problem because if they silence us, we can't defend ourselves against this. Here are some examples of some prime targets for this campaign of defeating, resisting, smearing, silencing, and ultimately neutralizing. You know three of them, I think, very well. One of them is a colleague of mine who just migrated, I'm very proud to say, to be the Chief of Staff of the National Security Council. His name is Fred Fleitz, a great American who has been vilified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ADL, the Council on American Islamic Relations, using platforms like Facebook and Twitter to do it, as well as the mainstream media. This must stop. There's an interesting development just yesterday. You may have heard about it. This gentleman, who's just become the Chancellor of Austria, has begun taking some rather important steps to try to protect his country against these Sharia supremacist Muslims, closing 7 of their mosques, shutting down one of their front groups, like these Muslim Brotherhood operations, and beginning to push back in earnest, as are other nations of primarily Eastern Europe. But get this, even in Western Europe, apparently Germany, no less, has finally realized that maybe it's a good idea to keep most of these migrants someplace else, as in outside of the European Union. There's hope. We need to be pushing back as well. So that is the first bit, the Sharia supremacist bit. Let me turn to the next. Another existential threat to freedom, those of you who have been with me before know I'm very concerned about, and I think many of you are as well, and should be, is the vulnerability of this country to a kill shot. Conceivably, a single nuclear weapon detonated in space could do the trick. I'm talking, of course, about the grid, our Achilles heel, 3 interconnects. You'll notice that much of that yellow stuff is where we are. That's one of the 3 elements of the grid. These are some of the most important parts of it, these high voltage transformers. We've got about 2,100 of them. If they go south on us, we're toast. How? Because if we don't have electricity, none of these other infrastructures, critical infrastructures, will operate. How could that happen? Well, our enemies are very well aware. You could do it through physical sabotage. You could use cyber techniques. You could use this electromagnetic pulse generated by a nuclear weapon in space, for example. Or, even if nobody attacks us, at some point it is absolutely certain that there will be a solar storm of sufficient magnitude to fry our grid, unless we protect it. Now, there are ways to protect it, and the military has been doing a pretty good job of this. Way back when I was in the Reagan administration, we were hard at this. It's important to do it for our civilian grid as well, but we haven't. And these are just some reasons that are perhaps hard to believe, but you need to understand that unless we do something about this, all other things being equal, we are going to remain vulnerable to the sorts of attacks that our enemies know could destroy us as not only a country, but honestly, as a civilization. The good news here is that we are working with people right here in the Western Interconnect at the state level, because Washington, as you may have heard, is not working very well at the moment. This is an opportunity to do something at the state level or regionally or both that can be a model for the entire country. We need your help. We're going to have a workshop about all of this afternoon at 3:30 in room 504. Please come learn what you can do to try to protect the grid. Okay, lastly, I'm going to talk about the new initiative. Something I haven't discussed with you before, but I have the feeling is weighing on you as it is on me. And I'm going to tell you just a very quick story about how this has come to be, this new initiative. About 50 years ago, a handful of Jewish activists were desperate to do something about another persecuted minority in the Soviet Union. They started putting up signs in front of synagogues and some churches, and lo and behold, it caught fire. It became a movement. And the movement became political capital, which a guy I actually had the privilege of working for too, by the name of Henry Scoop Jackson. A Democrat they don't make anymore, ladies and gentlemen. But that guy turned the deal of no most favored nation status for the Soviets unless they let the Jews and anybody else out who wanted to go into the end of détente and set up Ronald Reagan for the economic coup de grace that, among other things, finished off the Soviet Union a few years later. This is a miracle, folks. A miracle. Because it not only freed Soviet Jews, of course, it freed hundreds of millions of other people. And it started with signs. As a friend of mine said, a few Jews with signs brought down an empire. Think about what we could do for another persecuted population. You're probably familiar with this photograph. Shortly after it was taken, these men were all beheaded on a beach in Libya by the Islamic State. Sadly, they're not the only ones. According to Open Doors, 215 million Christians around the world. Did you hear that? 215 million Christians around the world are not just having bad days because they're Christians. They're being brutally persecuted in ways like this. They're being raped, they're being tortured, they're being enslaved, they're being crucified, they're being murdered, even genocidally. There are people who are trying to do something about this. I'm sure they're represented here, and I know people like you are supporting them. Thank you for doing so. It's tremendously important and often very dangerous work. But these folks, many of them, have come in alongside an effort to do something more because they know something more needs to be done because this persecution isn't stopping. So, with the help of my colleagues here, we have examples of what I'd like to ask you to think about doing to emulate, hopefully, the beginning of the miracle that might actually wind up saving maybe millions of Christians, as the Jackson Vanik did with those signs half a century ago. We're putting these in the hands of people like you, one per customer, to take to your church or your synagogue or other house of worship and ask whoever runs the place to put them outside so that everybody driving by, as well as the people going in, will know there are people there who care about Christians. So here's some examples of what it looks like. Make one in front of yours. These are ways we're amplifying the messaging. We need help in every single one of these respects. And here are the things we're trying to do to make a difference above and beyond just symptomatically helping those who are suffering. We want the U.S. government, you've heard a lot of talk about maximum pressure on North Korea, right? It turns out that's the worst persecutor of Christians in the world. I hope the president will be making that point next week. But in every other respect, we need to turn up the heat on these guys. We need, as Scoop Jackson and Ronald Reagan did, we need to make sure that there are costs associated with persecuting Christians. And with your help, I believe we will, in fact, save the persecuted Christians. God bless you all. Thank you for letting me join you yet again. Thank you, T.